Stone Age, let's start at the very beginning of human history. The earliest weapon wasn't designed at all. It was just a rock or a heavy piece of wood, a stone club or a hand axe, sharpened stone flakes that could be used to slice and smash. Experimental archaeology, where researchers actually make and test replica weapons on animal carcasses and synthetic bone, has shown that stone clubs and hand axes could fracture skulls and have often caused fatal wounds. You just needed one good swing. But a rock has a very obvious limitation. You have to be right next to someone to use it. And so, at some point in prehistory, someone figured out that a sharpened stick was even better. The spear was the first real weapon, purpose-built, designed to kill at a distance, effective for both hunting and warfare. Wooden shafts tipped with stone or bone points and later more refined heads became the most widespread weapon of the Stone Age. You could thrust with it in close quarters or throw it. It gave you range, it gave you options, and it worked. Spears were used for hundreds of thousands of years across virtually every human culture on Earth, which tells you everything you need to know about how effective they were. Then, sometime in the Upper Paleolithic, we're talking tens of thousands of years ago, someone figured out that you could store and release energy by bending a piece of wood and attaching a string. The bow and arrow changed everything. A well-aimed arrow from a bow made of wood and later composite designs of wood and sinew could kill large game or a human opponents before they ever got close enough to fight back. Suddenly, the person who was physically smaller or slower or outnumbered had a real chance. Range became the greatest equalizer. The bow would go on to dominate warfare for tens of thousands of years, and the basic principle never stopped being relevant. So, in the Stone Age alone, you already have the two fundamental categories: weapons for close quarters and weapons that kill from a distance, Bronze Age. But the Bronze Age gave humanity the ability to make weapons that could cut through other weapons. When metalworking emerged around 3300 BC, the composite bow, already established by the late Stone Age, got its most powerful upgrade yet. Made from wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, the Bronze Age composite bow launched arrows with far greater power and range than anything that came before it. Archaeologists have called it the deadliest weapon of the Bronze Age. Horse archers using composite bows could ride in, loose volley of arrows, and be gone before infantry had any chance to respond. Mobility plus range plus penetrating power, it was an almost impossible combination to counter. But bronze also produced the sword. The Egyptian Khopesh, a curved single-shaped bronze blade, became one of the defining weapons of the era. Its curved edge could hook around shields and slice through all the armor in ways that straight blades couldn't manage as easily. Swords became status weapons, carried by royalty and frontline warriors, and then there were chariots. If you want to understand the scale of Bronze Age warfare, consider this. At the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC between the Hittites and the Egyptians, both sides together fielded an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 chariots, making this the largest chariot battle ever recorded. Think lightweights, horse-drawn platforms carrying archers and spearmen, moving fast across open ground. A chariot crew that could unleash volleys of arrows while moving, then wheel away before the enemy could close. They changed the entire logic of how armies were built and how wars were fought. Spears were also still around, now tipped with metal. Longer pikes appeared in mass formations that could hold cavalry at bay. The sling, simple but devastatingly effective in the hands of a skilled user, could hurl a lead ball or stone with lethal force across several hundred feet. So, the Bronze Age didn't abandon the old categories, it deepened them. Middle Ages. Then came the Middle Ages. This era tends to get romanticized: knights, castles, chivalry. But strip away the mythology and what you have is an arms race between armor and the weapons designed to defeat it. The English longbow is where most people start, and for good reason. Standing 6 to 7 feet tall with draw weights of up to 150 to 180 pounds, the longbow fired arrows that could penetrate mail armor and thinner plate and exploit gaps in heavier armor at a range of around 300 yards. At Agincourt in 1415, for instance, A heavily outnumbered English force of longbowmen devastated a French army of armored knights. The arrows came down so fast and in such volume that the French advance collapsed before it ever reached the English lines. Crécy, Sluys, Agincourt. Battle after battle in the 14th and 15th centuries was decided before the melee even started by thousands of men with bows. But walls changed everything. Castles meant that the decisive battle might not happen in the open field at all. It might happen over months or years, with one side trying to break through stone and the other trying to hold it. That's where siege engines came in. The counterweight trebuchets could hurl a stone weighing around 190 pounds, some 600 to 900 feet, with enough force to crack fortifications. Torsion-powered ballistae, which were essentially giant crossbows, could launch heavy bolts with enough accuracy to pick off individual soldiers at distances of up to around 500 yards. Siege warfare was slow, grinding, and expensive, but with the right machinery, no wall was truly safe. And then there's Greek fire, a Byzantine weapon that really does deserve special attention because nothing else in the medieval world worked the same way. It was a liquid-based fire weapon, probably derived in part from petroleum or similar substances, projected from ship-mounted siphons during naval battles. When it struck, it ignited on contact and continued burning even when it hit the sea. That last part is what made it so frightening. Water, the obvious response to fire aboard a ship, was largely ineffective. Modern accounts repeatedly emphasize that crews could not put it out by conventional means. In fact, in naval engagements, the appearance of Byzantine ships could be enough to break enemy morale, with some sources describing crews abandoning their vessels rather than facing it. Greek fire's impact was also psychological. Its use significantly contributed to Byzantine naval dominance in certain periods, to the point that some opposing fleets were reluctant to engage Byzantines at sea at all. The Byzantines guarded the method of making and employing Greek fire as a state secret, passing it down with tightly controlled circles. Although rival powers developed their own incendiary weapons and made repeated attempts to copy it, none seem to have reproduced its exact combination of composition, delivery, and reliability. The original formula has never been conclusively recovered, and depending on how you look at it, that's either a loss to history or a small mercy. Early modern gunpowder era. Here is where things accelerate. Gunpowder made most of what came before obsolete. It started in China with something called the fire lance, a spear with a tube of gunpowder attached to the shaft. When ignited, it spewed flame and shrapnel at close range, a combination of flamethrower and shotgun that terrified anyone on the receiving end. It was crude and its range was only about 10 feet, but it was the direct ancestor of every firearm that followed. By the 14th century, metal-barreled cannons had arrived in Europe. Early bombards, massive, unwieldy things, could launch stone or iron balls weighing hundreds of kilograms over distances of around a mile. And the thing about cannons is what they did to castles. Every medieval fortification had been built on the assumption that walls thick enough and high enough were effectively permanent. Cannons made that assumption wrong. Overnight, centuries of military architecture became vulnerable. Armies that had spent generations perfecting the art of siege warfare had to start over. Handheld firearms followed, the arquebus and then the musket, using matchlock mechanisms to hurl bullets at targets 100 meters away or more. They were slow to reload, so battles still needed pike formations to protect the musketeers while they prepared their next shot. But by the 17th century, mass volleys of musket fire were replacing the longbow as the dominant way to kill people in the open field. The age of the skilled individual archer who had trained for years to be lethal was ending, and the age of the drilled infantry line was beginning. Gunpowder era changed who held power, shifted the balance from the strongest warrior on the field to the state that could manufacture, supply, and coordinate destruction at scale. World War I. Okay, up to this point, we've been talking about eras, centuries, sometimes millennia, where weapons evolved slowly enough that you could map the changes across generations. That stops here. From the First World War onward, the pace of weapons development accelerated so dramatically that individual conflicts define the periods better than broad eras do. World War I announced that shift with artillery. More than 58% of British casualties on the Western Front were caused by shell fire. Heavy guns bombarded trenches continuously, crushed barbed wire, destroyed fortifications, and produced a kind of industrialized killing that earlier eras had no framework to comprehend. The men who marched off to war in 1914 had grown up in a world of cavalry charges and regimental honor. What they found was mud and noise and a shell that could kill you from 2 miles away without any warning at all. Machine guns made open ground lethal. The Vickers machine gun could fire around 600 rounds per minute and ranges of over 3 miles with water cooling that allowed sustained fire that earlier rapid-fire weapons couldn't maintain. Defenders with belts of ammunition and a clear field of fire could stop an infantry advance in minutes. The results were stalemates, which is why the war lasted for years instead of 4 months. Then came poison gas. Mustard gas, first deployed in 1917, caused severe burns to the skin, lungs, and eyes, and could linger in low-lying areas for days, making trenches genuinely uninhabitable. The United States Army alone suffered over 70,000 gas casualties. It didn't kill as efficiently as artillery, but it introduced a new category of suffering. Weapons that attacked the body in ways that felt like a violation of some basic rule about how war was supposed to work. The international community eventually agreed, banning chemical weapons after the war. Though, as we already know, that ban wasn't always respected. World War II. If the First World War marked the industrialization of killing, the Second World War pushed it into full mechanization. Weapons became faster, heavier, more reliable, and crucially capable of striking far beyond the front line. Distance no longer guaranteed safety, so entire societies were drawn into the logic of total war. Air power was the clearest expression of that shift. Strategic bombing extended the principle of artillery, destroy what the enemy needs to fight, to a continental scale. Factories, rail yards, power plants, ports, and housing were all treated as legitimate targets on the assumption that civilian industry and morale were inseparable from military capacity. By the later years of the war, bombers operated in vast formations, guided by radar, navigation beacons, and centralized planning systems that allowed sustained campaigns lasting months or years. The human cost, as you know, was enormous. Allied bombing of Germany killed an estimated 600,000 civilians and left millions homeless. In Japan, where cities were densely built and largely constructed from wood, the effects were even more devastating. The firebombing of Tokyo on the nights of March 9th to 10th, 1945, created a firestorm that took the lives of around 100,000 people, destroyed roughly a quarter of the city, and is still considered the deadliest conventional air raid in history. This escalation culminated in the use of nuclear weapons. On August 6, 1945, a single bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion released energy equivalent to roughly 15 kilotons of TNT. Temperatures near the hypocenter reached several thousand degrees Celsius, and a blast wave flattened most structures within a mile radius. An estimated 80,000 people were killed almost instantly. Many more died in the following weeks from burns, trauma, and acute radiation sickness. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The terrain limited the blast somewhat, but the destruction was still catastrophic. Tens of thousands were killed outright, and the long-term effects, think radiation-induced cancers, genetic damage, and chronic illness, persisted for decades in both cities. Taken together, the two atomic bombings ended the lives of an estimated 150 to 250,000 people, more than any single technological development before or since. They demonstrated that modern warfare had reached a point where a single weapon could erase a city, and that the battlefield now extended everywhere human beings lived. The Cold War. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world knew exactly what nuclear weapons could do, and then both superpowers spent the next 4 decades building more of them, bigger ones. The Soviet Tsar Bomba, tested on October 30th, 1961, had a yield of approximately 50 megatons. To put that in context, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was around 15 kilotons. The Tsar Bomba was thousands of times more powerful than that. Its fireball was several miles wide, and the shockwave was detected going around the Earth 3 times by monitoring stations. Had it been detonated over a city, it would have vaporized everything within tens of miles and caused fatal burns across a radius far beyond that. It was never intended to be a practical weapon. It was a demonstration. The Soviet Union's way of telling the United States exactly what it was capable of building, and the United States already knew because it had been building its own. By the height of the Cold War, both superpowers had deployed thermonuclear warheads on intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach targets anywhere on Earth in about 30 minutes. Submarines carried missiles that could be launched from anywhere in the ocean, making them nearly impossible to preempt. In the end, the logic of deterrence, that both sides had enough weapons to survive a first strike and still destroy the other, was the only thing standing between the world and something that had no name yet.